You know, right. Nick Durst here with Joe Calabrese and Joe, our guest today. Well, I used to go by another alias name, and we'll get into that, but now he goes by his real name. Tell everybody who we got with us today.
Yes, he does. He's a guy who has worn many hats in media. He's been an anchor, he's been an announcer, he's been a producer, he's been a reporter. He's bounced around a couple of different locations. Most notably, a lot of people will remember him from WWE, calling NXT. Currently works for Gow Media. Somebody we're really happy to have on. Thank you to our great friend Alex Alberio for helping us out here. Rich Bocchini. Rich, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm good, and I appreciate you guys having me. I'm glad you get to talk to Alex. He's a longtime friend of mine. I'm going to correct you, though. Bocchini.
What's Bocchini?
Bocchini.
Gotcha.
But that's okay, because nobody ever gets it right. And that's the closest. I'm gonna send you guys both a Coke, because that was the closest that most people get. Most people, they like I always joke when I call like the credit card company, right? Or I call the airline or like whatever, right? And they're like, "Oh, hello, hello, Mr. Richard. How can I help you?" And they default to my first name. So it's all good. But I'm happy to be here. I love talking to fellow announcer types and media types, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Appreciate you coming on here. Now, you went to Rhode Island College. You studied communications and public relations. When you were going to school there, did you have in your mind that you wanted to pursue a career on air, or were you just thinking, let me get this communications degree and see where that takes me post-graduation?
When I first went to school, I had intended becoming a teacher. That was kind of the idea. Rhode Island College is known for being, quote unquote, a teacher college. And that was kind of the idea behind that. On the other hand, I was into college radio at the time. And it's funny when I think back about it, one of the reasons why I actually went to Rhode Island College instead of URI is that it was easier to get on the college radio station at Rick than it was at URI. And I wanted to do college radio. I did a music show at, midnight. I think it was on Sunday nights or whatever. And I'd play, all sorts of stuff. I'd play, metal and hardcore and punk and indie and honestly, whatever I felt like, really. And, I called the show Trainwreck with Rich because if, with radio, like, if you play stuff that's jarring, they call it a train wreck. And I didn't care. That's what I did. I'd play a Slayer song and then I'd play something by the Sundays or the Smiths or right after that. And so I did that, but I think pretty quick I realized that, one, I didn't really want to, not that I didn't want to be a teacher, but I wanted to get out of Rhode Island. I didn't want to be stuck in Pawtucket my entire life. Even if I ended up back there, I wanted to go and do other stuff. And the other thing with that is, I realized I didn't want to be I didn't want to be a DJ. I didn't want to be music radio guy and kind of be that guy on the radio that, you end up playing Skinner records or something like that. Hey, here's here's Stairway to Heaven for the 1000th time. Like I didn't want to do that. And it was, I think maybe so I have a daughter. I have a 24-year-old daughter. So right around that time is when when I found out my daughter was on the way. So I took some time off from school. I was working a job, and I remember sitting out on my lunch break, sitting in the car, listening, of all things, to a Providence Bruins game. I'm a big hockey fan, played hockey in high school, love hockey. And that was the second it kind of clicked to me. I was like, wait a minute. I could announce hockey on the, I don't know why I never really thought about that before. Because I'd always liked listening, paying attention to the play-by-play guys. Was a big Fred Cusick and Derek Sanderson fan who did the Bruins back on TV 38 back in the day. That's kind of in that sort of coalesced for me. I was like, oh no, I don't want to do the Howard Stern route or shock jock DJ or whatever. So I'll never forget it, sitting in my car listening to a game and being like, maybe I could do that. And off to the races, and 25 years later, almost, here we are. It's been a crazy ride.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask one about internships, because you told us the school was known for really teaching. So we always usually ask this. Must have been difficult trying to find stuff. And we also noticed that you have seemed to bounce around here, a lot of different minor league stops over the course of a 5 to 10 year period here. So just lead us into your time out of college. How did your first big break materialize? And then kind of guide us here through your next couple of stops here, and what made you jump around and do this and this and that.
So when I went back to school, and around the same time, right after my daughter was born, went back to school because I wanted to finish my degree. I didn't want to not do that. But obviously changed my focus a little bit. Decided to kind of go to the PR media route. Being in Providence, or growing up in Rhode Island, and being there were a lot of American Hockey League teams nearby at that time. That's kind of dwindled a little bit because the league has changed a lot. But at the time, I could drive 2 hours to Hartford, I could drive an hour to Worcester, I could drive an hour to Lowell, I could drive 2 hours to Manchester. Could go to these different places that weren't that far away. And I did, and I had my tape deck. I had an old Tascam 4-track actually for a while that I would go, and I would go to the games, and I'd get a press pass and sit way down at one end of the press box area, and I would sit there and I would call games into a tape deck, and then listen to them on the 2-hour ride home, and kind of speed through them, like I didn't like this, or I like that, and that's kind of how I kind of cut my teeth. Like, I like how that sounded. I didn't like how I approached that. Like, those types of things. I guess maybe my first break was probably really working for the hockey team in Worcester Ice Cat. I ended up kind of interning with them. I interned in Providence with Bruins for a season, and then ended up in Worcester for a couple years, being an intern there, doing PR stuff, running game notes, making the copies, calling the American Hockey League hotline, do like all that type of stuff. And they all, the people there knew that I wanted to get my feet wet in radio, so they put me on the air. I would do interviews, I would do different things. In was it 99? I think a new radio guy came in, and anyway, I ended up doing color with him. He had some connections in the old United Hockey League, and so when Knoxville decided, I think the team had been there one year, but they decided they were finally going to do radio, and I sent my stuff, and he gave me a recommendation, and that kind of led to actually going and doing it. I think I don't even know what I made that first year, 18 grand or something like that. It was like the princely sum of barely being able to pay my rent and survive, but I was doing it, I was riding the bus, and I was doing it. From there, I went to Bridgeport for a year, and then ended up back in Worcester for a couple years, and then going down to Rio Grande in the Central Hockey League. But that's kind of that's a quick synopsis of how I got started. It was really though with the Ice Cats, with Worcester, and then being in proximity to so many AHL teams, and even some guys I'd go to games at Brown University sometimes as well, and they would set me up in the press box, and I'd just be able to practice calling games, and that's how I did it. Rhode Island College was in a big school. We didn't have hockey, we didn't have football. The radio station was just, we didn't do sports or anything like that. So that was really the only way that I knew how to do it, and that's what I did. And I know it's not completely unique, but I also know it's kind of a lost thing where the idea of like grabbing it, like literally a tape deck, and going and sitting in the press box and then listening to tapes on the way home. It was a good way to learn.
So tell us about the very unique experience where you and Alex are doing AHL games in English for a Mexican television station. What was that experience like for you?
So that was the Central Hockey League. It was the Rio Grande Valley Killer Bees, and that was really interesting. I was actually going to get out of hockey. This is 2005. My daughter at this point had moved to Florida with her mom and her stepdad, and I was in Rhode Island, and doing some other stuff. I was still, I was working for the Ice Cats. I was, I had a day job. I was in a band, trying to do that for a little bit. Had some, minimal success, I suppose, but we zipped around, and something that I wanted to do, so I got to do that. But I got a call from a friend of mine who was like, "Hey, I don't know if you're interested, but the team in Rio Grande has They have an opening. They have a hockey team. They do arena football, and they do TV. And I was like, oh, I'd never done TV. I want to do hockey on TV. All right. So I sent my stuff and ended up getting the gig. And I figured like at the worst, like I'll go there for a year and I'll get to see the Southwest. I'd never been to Texas. I'd never seen the Southwest. I'm like, how cool is this? AA hockey, ride the bus. You know, I had read Zamboni Rodeo, which is a great book about the old Western Professional Hockey League. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. If you're into bus league stuff and you're into that kind of thing, Zamboni Rodeo, great stuff. But I was like, oh, I'll get to do this. And worst comes to worst, if I hate it, I can leave. I ended up down there for 5 years. So the the TV thing was that was one of the things that was like, okay, I'm going to go and do this. It was really interesting. So we're based in Hidalgo, Texas, basically McAllen, Texas, but the arena was in Hidalgo. And from the roof of that arena, you can actually see the Mexican border. You can see the flags. And it's just kind of an interesting thing. You know, there's warm-ups going on. I'd go out on the roof or whatever and have a cup of coffee and just kind of chill for a minute. And I'd be like, there's warm-ups going on there for pro hockey, and that's Mexico right there. And it was unique. The TV broadcast was it was interesting. The entire crew spoke Spanish. Their English was very limited. My Spanish was very limited. But we somehow made it work. I mean, you know, we weren't going to win any sports Emmys or anything like that, but we made it work. And I remember this one guy, Gus, was the camera guy that they put top with us because he spoke the English. So we were kind of able to, I would do play-by-play, but I was also kind of like half producing the broadcast as well, because I'd see stuff and like just things that, you know, they didn't necessarily know to look for, like, you know, with a minute and a half left or whatever, and a team's down by 1, what are you looking for? You're looking for the goalie, right? And I would see the goalie come out to like the hash marks, and they wouldn't cut to a clip, and I'd be like going nuts, like pointing at him, like pointing behind the play, like at the goalie, you know, and then they would get it, and they, you know, they'd finally like figure out what was going on. But it was fun. That was an interesting time. It was you know, it was funny to think about, like, yeah, we're actually on a broadcast channel out of Matamoros, Mexico. They had a deal with the local cable company on the US side where they would show the games on Saturdays, and you think about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, it almost sounds fake, right? Like I called hockey in English on a Mexican TV station, but it was really cool. They were great people to work with. The fans down there got into the game. It's kind of a shame that you know, the economics of everything just, you know, eventually didn't work, but it was you know, for a 5-year period, that was I look back at that and I'm like, you know, how I'm so lucky that I got to do that. You know, really good times.
Had a lot of fun there. You mentioned you were in Houston for 5 years. So wanted to ask you, getting hired by CBS Radio, and then you were the stadium announcer for the Houston Dynamo.
Yeah.
Which is real interesting. So how did those opportunities come about for you, and who was responsible for bringing you there?
So when I moved to Houston, I was the PR guy for the Arrows, for the AHL team there, and do radio for Houston. I filled in for a couple times. They had a play-by-play guy, but I figured it's Houston. It's a big city. It's the AHL. You know, they're affiliated with the Minnesota Wild. I'm like, all right, if I'm going to do this, kind of spinning my wheels in AA hockey, like I've done everything I can do at that level. Like, let's, you know, it's time to do something else. And being Houston, I figured that there would be other opportunities, which it turned out that there were. CBS Radio, so Joe O'Donnell, who's the radio guy for the Iowa Wild, was the radio guy for the Arrows in Houston. And he did part-time stuff at Sport Radio 610, CBS Radio. And, you know, one summer where I don't know why it didn't dawn on me earlier, but I asked him, like, hey, like, you know, what are I going to do to, like, you know, do updates or whatever? You know what I mean? There's something there's going to be something over there for me, you know? Just fill in stuff or whatever. So one thing led to another, and I met Gavin Spittle, who's now one of the top CBS Radio sports people. It's not even CBS anymore, is it? I can't even think what they're called now. But regardless,
Odyssey. It was on
Odyssey. Yeah.
Odyssey. Okay, yeah, I kicked because they were Westwood One, and then it was CBS. Yeah. But anyway, he's one of the top guys over there now. but he was the program director at 610, and met with him and sent him some stuff. So they brought me in doing sports flash updates, and they'd send me to Astros games or Rockets games or whatever to get sound and do that stuff. So that was fun. The Dynamo thing actually happened. So this is kind of funny. I lived in an apartment building like right next to where the Dynamo play, it's like across the street from Minute Maid Park. And then the Dynamo Stadium is there. So I was kind of sandwiched in the middle of that. And that was, I had been to Houston a couple years earlier, saw this apartment complex. I'm like, man, how cool would that be to live right next to the ballpark? And it turned out that I ended up, my ex-wife and I at that point ended up being able to get a place there. But I was driving to work one day, my day job, not with the Arrows, with another company that I worked for doing PR. And it sounded like they were doing tryouts. I heard it, and so I'm like, So just through some connections I had, I got a hold of them and sent them my stuff. They had me come in for an audition. They were like, yeah, you got the gig. So I did that for a season. I would have kept doing it had I stayed in Houston. But it's just stuff that, networking, playing the cards that you're dealt, figuring out, okay, I know this person. It seems like they're doing this. Well, why don't I talk to so-and-so and see if there's something there, which is for me, that's been 90% of the jobs that I've gotten in broadcasting has all been talking to somebody. Hey, this guy needs X. You could do this. Why don't you send him your stuff? So that was fun. I was never like a huge soccer fan. Liked it enough, but those games were a blast. I got to appreciate the game a lot more, and it was just fun. It was just fun calling, announcing the goals in the stadium with 15,000 people screaming, going nuts. It was a good time. I had a lot of fun. But yeah, as far as how those came up, it was just networking, talking to people, and just kind of trying to grease the skids any way you can, because you got to hustle doing this stuff.
Biggest differences for you between your play-by-play voice, your radio update voice, and your public address announcement voice?
Not that much different. I mean, I enunciate a lot better when I'm doing PA. Even doing play-by-play, doing radio, you speak a little bit differently. You speak more clearly. You speak more. I don't want to say succinctly, but I don't know. There's more emphasis on things you say. You just want to make sure that you're clear and that you're a little bit slower so people can understand you, as opposed to my usual Northeast, sometimes mile a minute. the way you guys are from New York, you get it.
Of course.
So so a lot of it's just kind of slowing down and just remembering to slow down your delivery. But I've never been much for the whole I'm on the radio and I'm going to talk like I'm on the radio. I listen to baseball games now sometimes, or just stuff on, and I hear some of these announcers and I'm like, dude, enough. You know what I mean? Well, it's a fly ball to right field. Well, the left fielder got under it. God, shut up. You know what I mean? Just talk like a human being. Drives me out of my mind.
True.
So anyway, yeah, it's not a huge difference.
So now you get hooked up with the five-time WCW champion.
Yeah.
With Reality of Wrestling. Were you always a wrestling fan? What was your wrestling fandom up to this point? And how did that opportunity come about for you to work with Booker T and his promotion?
Yeah, weird stuff. Again, just stuff happening in right place, right time, and all those cliches, right? I'd been a wrestling fan my entire life. Growing up in Providence, at the time when I was a kid, we still got WWF shows pretty much every month in Providence. So did Boston. That's when they were still running their monthly schedules, or bi-monthly or whatever. But they were there every month, it seemed like. So my dad would take me to shows. I'd beg him to take me to shows, so we would go. I'd go to Boston every now and then. Even though I grew up in that area, I gravitated more towards the Jim Crockett promotion style, the NWA style, TBS, in the studio, world champion, before it was WCW, before it became the glitzy WWF knockoff that it became. I was into the gritty, Southern style wrestling, right? The stuff that Jim Cornette still raves about. And I agree with him. To me, it felt real. And even as a kid, knowing that, all right, this thing's not on the up and up, it just felt more real than the WWF stuff did, because the WWF stuff was cartoony and whatever. And I loved Hogan and I loved all that stuff, but there was just something about the grittiness of like those darkened arenas, and it looked real. It felt real. And some of the angles that they did, you're like, not really quite sure where reality ends and the show begins. And to me, that's when wrestling's at its best, when you have to think for a second, like, I know this isn't on, but that might have, and you hear the old timers talk about that all the time. Well, the rest of those matches were fake, but that match was real, And a lot of the old timers think like that. They didn't care what the fans thought as long as they thought their match was real. So anyway, long story short, yeah, big wrestling fan, was into it, watched as much of it as I could as a kid. Kind of drifted away from it a little bit the older I got, just, with school and becoming a dad and blah, 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 blah. When I went to Rio Grande, I had, for the first time in a while, I had downtime, and I'd be home, on like a Monday night. I remember what it was. It was flipping through channels one night, and Triple H had a sledgehammer, and Ric Flair was all bloody, and that led to a match at Survivor Series, and that kind of hooked me back into it a little bit more, probably because it was Flair that was involved in it. And it was maybe 05 or 06 or something like that. And I slowly kind of got back into it, and one thing led to another. Ended up in Houston. You mentioned Alex Del Barrio. He was doing the show for Booker. He left to go on tour with the Globetrotters, recommended me, and met Booker from another job that I had. It just all worked out. The timing worked out. Right place again. Right place, right time. And man, never would have thought just from that I'd end up doing some of the stuff that I did. But it's you never know. You never know how the stars are going to align. And they aligned in strange ways for me.
So you end up, of course, with WWE, and then later on, Alex comes to visit you, and he ends up with WWE. But how did you initially sync up with them? Was it Booker T helping you out? And what was your audition process like? I'm sure they flew you out to Orlando, and you had some sort of tape or something like that. How'd that go?
Yeah. So I had actually at one point, I had interviewed with the Houston Texans. And by the way, is my internet connection okay? Am I lagging here? Because it looks like I'm lagging on my end. Is it all good?
I think you're fine.
I'm good. Okay. There's a hurricane coming through as we're recording this, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. So I just wanted to make sure.
Down in Florida?
What's that?
You down in Florida?
Yeah. I'm in Florida, so keeping an eye on the storm that's coming through. Anyway, I had interviewed for the Texans. I was working a day job that was just not a good situation, and wanted to get out. Gavin, actually, the guy that I mentioned from CBS Radio, recommended me to the Texans, to Mark Vandermeer, who's the play-by-play guy with the Texans. I'm not a huge football guy, and I think that was pretty obvious. But Mark and I talked, and I didn't get the job, but he was very complimentary of my work, liked my play-by-play work, and told me flat out, he's like, you should be doing big league sports somewhere. And he's like, I know you've kind of, at that point, I don't want to say that I'd given up on play-by-play, but I was kind of like, I'm not going back to AA hockey for, not being able to pay the rent. You know what I mean? I had done that. So that wasn't really, I was married at the time. That wasn't an option. But anyway, he kind of pushed me. He's like, you should be doing something somewhere. And, if you can find something, or if I can help or whatever. So I actually went home, mentioned it to my wife at the time, and she kind of nudged me to talk to Booker. I was already working with him. She's like, why don't you talk to Book and see if there's something at WWE? And, the funny thing is, I had kind of gotten out of hockey because I got tired of the hours, and I got tired of, some of the travel and just the lifestyle where it's just nonstop. And at that point, I was like, okay, I got married. It's time to get a real job and do the right thing. So I'm home at night, and I'm home on, all that stuff. I was not happy at all. And she could tell that, I need to be doing stuff. That's just how I am. And I talked to Book. I was hesitant to talk to him about it because a lot of guys will go in there and they think because he's Booker T and because they're training with him that that's their meal ticket to WWE. And that's not what he does. You have to prove it to him. And even then, you only get so many chips you can cash in, even though he's so well respected. He's not going to push everybody to them, right? But I talked to him, and he liked my work, and he's like, yeah, put something together, and I'll get it in the right hands. And one thing led to another. Michael Cole came to a show that we did. I forget, was it Extreme? I forget what pay-per-view it was, but it was a pay-per-view in December. And that was obviously on a Sunday. We had a show the night before. Cole came up to a show. I met Cole, did a couple matches with him, and next thing I know, I'm flying down to Florida for an audition, and they offered me a deal. So here we go. Let's pack up the apartment. Off we go to Orlando, and it was boy. I think about it now. Wow. It's just crazy to think how it worked out, and some of the opportunities and places I've been and things I've done from there. But yeah, book was a huge part of that. Him and Charmel giving me the opportunity with Reality of Wrestling. And, if there's any wrestlers or would-be wrestlers listening to this, I say this all the time. If you want to get into the business and you don't go and spend at least 6 months or whatever training at Reality of Wrestling in Houston with Booker, you're missing out. They're set up there, their TV setup, like you're going to learn even on the production side. If you want to do that, that's where to go. That's the place to go. And if you don't, you're selling yourself short. But yeah, Charmel was a big help. Booker was a big help. Kevin Bernhardt, who's, their lead guy, their lead production guy, they're huge helps. And, like I said, man, it's just crazy thinking about like the progression of how these things happened. And some of it just almost seemingly by chance, right? It was never my goal to be a WWE announcer, because how do you even do that, right? It's like kids grow up. I'm going to be a wrestler when I grow up. Okay, yeah, sure, kid. You're going to be an astronaut too, right? And yeah, it's just funny how it all worked out. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I know I'm kind of rambling here a bit.
Sure, yeah. Now we've had some other wrestling guests on. We've had on Adnan Verka, we had Scott Sanford, Jimmy Corderas. They kept their names for the most part. We asked Alex, we asked Arda their name origin story. So how did you become Rich Brennan?
I wanted to be Breton, Rich Breton, Breton. That's my mom's maiden name. And I thought that kind of pays homage to them. It's easy enough to say. It's still RB. It's still right. And Cole looked at me and he's like, well, if you're going to be Breton, why not just be Brennan? It's easier. And I was like, okay, but there was a hockey player named Rich Brennan who actually played for the Bruins and played at BU. And I was like, there's a hockey player named, it doesn't matter. He wasn't beat up, but nobody remembers him. So I became Rich Brennan. But it's, yeah, that was it. They, the same thing, they give you the list. You send them a list. I had gotten a list back with just all these awful, like cartoony, like Italian names. And I'm like, no. Not that I'm ashamed by any means of my Italian heritage, right? But like, I didn't want to be Richie Goomba or whatever.
Richie
Goomba. Yeah, you know what I mean? That wasn't a name they gave me, but it was like names like that where I'm just like, come on, like no, you know what I mean? No. And yeah, so they they cleared it with legal, and Cole was like, yeah, Rich Brennan. So that's how that came about. But yeah, it was supposed to be Breton, which in French Breton, whatever. But anyway, yeah, that's how that came about.
So
not that exciting of a story.
Yeah, no. So you had the opportunity to do play-by-play for NXT during my favorite period of the whole brand's iteration, and something that you mentioned before that I think is a really good comparison for NXT is what you said about how you grew up really enjoying the territories, because I do think NXT is this very stripped down version of pro wrestling. There are elements of Jim Crockett and Smoky Mountain and all the territories, while there was also that intimate feel, kind of like how the old ECW was, with the crowd being like right on top of you. So I want to ask, do you kind of agree with that assessment? And because it was structured how it was, did it make you enjoy doing the job at the time even more?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and absolutely. And And I agree with you. And I mean, I'm biased obviously because I was there, but to me that, like, when I look at the run of NXT, from late, mid 2014 to me, I kind of cut it off after the first Brooklyn show because that's when it started to change. But that whole run was just, it was unbelievable. Like it was WWE production, but not too over the top. And it was very territory. It was very Crockett. It was like NXT, even now, NXT is probably the closest thing to pro wrestling that exists. And I say that, doing other wrestling stuff as well, but like just for basic, just a straight ahead wrestling show, Ring of Honor is relatively straightforward. MLW does some stuff that's straightforward, but there's also, there's some, I don't want to say fantasy stuff, but there's more story stuff with some of the MLW stuff that I've done. I'm not knocking that by any means, but yeah, just a straight ahead wrestling show, just mostly believable, 90% believable, but emotion as well. Like you were invested in the characters as opposed to, and I don't like saying characters. You were invested into the wrestlers, as opposed to like spot fest type stuff where it's just a bunch of moves and there's no psychology and there's independent stuff. The story that I always tell, or that I always like to point to, is the whole Neville Sami Zayn, Adrian Neville championship run, where Sammy's the underdog and he's the good guy, and he keeps on getting screwed because he's the good guy and he's friends with Neville, but Neville keeps on taking cheap wins from him, but he's like, no, I'm still your friend. But Sammy's getting progressively more pissed, and Neville is he's not a heel, but he's kind of right. So it's this whole thing where Sammy's on this quest for the title, and I think a lot of people relate to it. You try to do the right thing, and you try to do things right because you're a good person, and you just try to be honest, and you try to be upfront and trustworthy in the things you do, and you keep on getting screwed, right? Nice guys finish last. I think a lot of us can relate to that. And, the culmination of that, if you remember in the TakeOver Our Evolution match is, the referee's down, like Neville grabs the belt and the ref gets it and the ref gets knocked out. So now Sammy's got the belt and he's looking at the belt and he can knock out Neville because the referee's out cold, and he can hit Neville with the belt and pin him and get the ref and win the belt. But he doesn't want to do that because that's against his moral code. He's looking at the belt or whatever. So then he's going to do it, and then he doesn't do it, and then Neville rolls him up and almost beats him again, right? And then the match goes on. Finally, Sammy hits the haluva kick and wins the title. And like the pop in that place that night, I've said before, that was the hockey championship that I never won. I was lucky enough to call 2 Calder Cup finals, or be involved in 2 Calder Cup finals when I was in pro hockey, once with Bridgeport, once with Houston, and we lost both times. The time that I was with Bridgeport was in Chicago. I saw what the crowd was like. I was there for, the championship win and the celebration for Chicago. I liken it to that when Sammy won the title that night, because it was a real reaction. It wasn't a wrestling fan reaction like, yeah, our guy. There was catharsis there. There really was. And
Kevin Owens comes out and it's
that blindsides him, and then you're off to the races with the next part of the story, which got cut short because of injuries and call-ups and whatever. But that time period and that story, the Zayn Neville story in particular, it was probably a 6 or 7 month build to that, which is how you did it back in the day. Everything moves so quickly now in wrestling where it's like week to week, you have to keep up, and there's no time to care about anything.
Right.
It just moves so quick and everything's just kind of throwaway. They built that. So I guess kind of going back to your, to your original question, like, did I find it more fun or whatever? So I was still learning TV at that point. I had done some sports TV, but I'd never done TV like in a WWE way where it's very fast paced and there's a lot of moving parts. That was a huge learning curve for me. But as far as the actual product, the actual wrestling, like I was so excited. I mean, I was, Dusty Rhodes was still there, so I got to know Dusty a little bit. So his influence is there and getting to pick his brain. And it was pretty obvious that Hunter was a fan of Dusty's booking it at Jim Crockett because like that's what NXT felt like at that point. It felt like an old NWA show. So yeah, it was just it was a lot of fun being involved in that time period, and you know, not that there wasn't good stuff after that, but man, it was just.
Well, you mentioned Brooklyn, the first takeover, which of course Joe and I were there. So we got to talk about the greatest match in NXT history.
Absolutely.
Sasha versus Bayley. Your thoughts on that whole storyline there? And it was kind of a joke because a few years ago they did the greatest NXT matches of all time list, and it was nonetheless the second one match was, but not the first, which was the greatest match in NXT history.
Yeah, I mean that was boy, you know, similar pop in some ways when Bayley won.
Special atmosphere.
Yeah,
because Kevin Owens versus Finn Balor in a ladder match was the main event, and
right.
You can clearly see as much as the crowd was still there, the crowd was taken away a little bit from how great that match was. So yeah.
I mean, it just, you know, that was at a point where I think a lot of that stuff had the opportunity to exceed expectations because they really weren't. There were expectations, but there weren't, if that makes sense. It's the first time that, though, you know, that type of match or that, you know, like NXT was in an arena of that size. Now, the interesting thing with that is like literally maybe a year before, maybe a little bit longer, but I mean, you know, we were doing shows in Florida in front of 100 people. We'd drive to Stark, or we would drive to, you know, Daytona sometimes, or I'm sorry, Cocoa. There were, you know, Leesburg. There were a couple places where like literally a year before there's like 50 or 100 people there. And to see that thing grow, and now like a year and a half later, you're in front of 15,000 people at the Barclays Center. I was like, oh, wow. I mean, it was surreal. It really was. It was unbelievable.
Right.
So, you know, the women's matches at that point were just kind of starting to get it like, oh, they're letting the women wrestle. Right. Oh wow, the women can wrestle. They're not just, you know.
They had the fatal four-way between Bayley, Sasha, Charlotte. And
so you remember more of the details than I do.
At some point, that's a match that you need to see on the main roster at WrestleMania, closing the showdown for a championship. But you know, you mentioned the worst part of the job is obviously the travel. NXT is great. You're in Orlando, and for the most part, you're not traveling. So, was it a bummer for you when they're telling you you're coming up to do SmackDown?
No, I actually like the travel. I like seeing different places. It's kind of a misnomer to say you don't travel in Florida because you're on the road 3 days a week. You're just in Florida, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, a typical Thursday would be you're at the Performance Center till, you know, from 9 to, I don't know, 1 or something. And then you go in to get lunch, and then you're driving to wherever, Jacksonville, Tampa, Fort Pierce, you know, 2 hours. No ride was really much more than 2.5, 3 hours. They wanted to keep it at that, but still, like, you know, you're up early, you're driving somewhere, you're setting up, you're doing a show, you're breaking down. By the time you get out of the building, it's, you know, 11 at night. Now you're driving home, and you're going to get something to eat, and you're home at 1 or 2, and there's stuff to do that, you know, when you get home. And then there's just normal life too, right? Just trying to, if you're married or if you have a significant other, just trying to be present for them. But you know, those Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you're zipping around to wherever. So there's not a lot of downtime in that regard. As far as the travel, like the main roster stuff, I enjoyed it. It was cool for me to like get on a plane and go to, you know, cities that I had never. I have wanderlust, right? So to be able to go and explore some of these places was awesome. I especially like the West Coast trips, because from Orlando you could get a 7 a.m. nonstop into like LAX or something, or, you know, Seattle if you're going there, and get into the city at 10:30 or 11 in the morning on a Sunday. And for me, I'm a baseball fan. I love checking out stadiums. That was awesome for me because there's a 1 o'clock game. Perfect, right? You know, so I get to see a couple stadiums in that regards, which was cool. So, you know, there's definitely pros and cons of both.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, the wrestlers have it. You know, when they're doing their house show schedules, that travel's grueling for them, being on the road, you know, at the time 4 days a week. For the announcers, it wasn't as bad. You'd fly out Sunday or home Wednesday, so it wasn't terrible.
Now, obviously, you definitely learned a lot in NXT, so that certainly prepared you to come up to SmackDown. I don't know how closely you follow the product these days, but do you think it was fair what WWE did in the sense that they hire Adnan Verka, a very well-known sports commentator, and they're basically throwing him to the wolves. His first match right away is on Raw, and they only gave him 7 weeks. I mean, how do you expect major growth in that time without any reps beforehand?
I don't get it. Don't get it. Didn't get it then. I felt bad for him.
Yeah.
Because I knew what he was up against. I don't know if that's a Nick Khan thing. You said you talked to him, you know him a little bit. I don't know if, I'm assuming Nick Khan being his former agent and being the boss over there now, that's how that happened. But I don't understand how you take anybody and you just pluck them from another world and insert them in there. Not only because, like, first of all, like, you have to understand the psychology of wrestling. And I don't know whether he does or not. I didn't watch Raw. I don't really keep up with it, but not only understanding the psychology of wrestling, but understanding how WWE wants things. And it's a weird thing because they tell you just be yourself. And then you go out there and, for me anyway, it was like, be yourself. Okay. And I'd be myself and they'd be like, yeah, but not like that. What do you mean? Well, more like this. Yeah, but then that's not being myself. You know what I mean? Like stupid stuff like that. But even figuring out the traffic, and I think Alex talked about this a little bit, where Adnan maybe had an advantage over some people is that he had done, he'd done anchoring and right. So that lends itself to WWE because if you look at like what Michael Cole does, he's a traffic cop and he'll say that I'm a traffic cop. That's his job. Play-by-play is almost secondary. It's traffic. It's being able to throw to packages, and the other part of it is being able to set up packages that you haven't seen, because a lot of times you don't get to, stuff is last minute, stuff changes on the fly, literally changes while you're out there. So you may have a note to toss to something and, in your head, you've sort of planned for that. So you know what's coming like any other normal TV show, right? And you throw to it. At WWE, a lot of times like that stuff had changed. So now like a transition that worked from one segment to the next that you thought, oh, this would be a good transition. Now all of a sudden that doesn't work. And you're on the fly and you got to bang. You have to come up with something to now not only make it make sense, but to also fit into the way that they want you to tell the story. Because you may interpret an element of that story slightly differently or whatever, right? So that stuff takes time to kind of figure out. So as far as a guy like Adnan, I mean, even I've said this before, even Mauro Ranallo, when he went in, Mauro's a play-by-play guy. I'm a play-by-play guy. Like, we're not necessarily traffic guys, which doesn't mean that we can't handle traffic. But it's just it's a much, I think the word I've used before, it's a much more linear thing when you do sports. When you do hockey, how many, there's going to be a whistle because of, you have however many breaks during the period, and when the period's over, you're going to throw it a break, you're going to come back, there's going to be an on-cam, you're going to set up a package that you already know what you're talking about, and it's easy. That's easy traffic. WWE, there's stuff a lot of times coming from left field, and again with the very specific verbiage and specific ways that they want you to tell the story, that becomes it's a hard thing to learn. I was there for 2 years and I was just starting to figure it out when they canned me. To take a guy like Adnan, who had never done, I'm assuming he'd never done any wrestling at all. Sorry, man, doesn't work. Doesn't work. And that's not a knock on him. I felt bad for him, and I felt bad reading the stuff, again, having been in his shoes to an extent, but having had more experience than him in wrestling, I was like, I don't know how they think this is going to work. I don't know who's smoking what over there, because this is dumb. This is dumb. They're setting this poor guy up to fail. They're making the TV show like, and the thing is, they've done it before. They brought in Mike Adamle before. So they already know this stuff doesn't work. So I don't understand why you do it again. Again, not a knock on Adnan at all.
Yeah. I mean, I personally thought he was great, but the IWC, the Internet Wrestling Community, is just brutal. And I don't know, how did you ignore those haters on social media during your heyday?
You just kind of chalk it up to whatever. I knew I had stuff to learn. I'm still learning today. That's the thing about doing wrestling, and you hear the old timers say that a lot. Like, you're always learning. You have to have that attitude, I think. I just kind of tuned it out. I mean, I get enough people rubbing my shoulders saying, hey man, it was awesome. And enough people say, you're the worst announcer ever. Like, whatever, I don't really didn't really faze me one way or the other. You know, and in some ways, the criticism, I enjoyed getting some criticism because as like wanting to get better, I was able to kind of filter out, okay, this is just some jerk in his basement who has nothing else to do except rag on the guy who's on TV, right? But there, you know, there are other people you'd see stuff where they'd be like, oh, you know, hey, like he actually, you know, you called this move, but it should have been this, right? I'm not super anal about that stuff. Like I know some people like, you know, you called it a suplex, it was actually a Saito suplex. Like, all right, come on, like stop splitting hairs, you know what I mean? But from an accuracy standpoint, you want to have that stuff. But just generally, I just kind of ignored it.
Last question here from WWE standpoint, and then we're going to move on.
Sure.
Who were the most important people there for you? Resources, people that you could talk to, willing to give you advice, feedback, and was there anybody there that you were close to that you still keep in contact closely with today?
You know, obviously Booker was a big part of me. You know, it's not like we talk all the time, but like I can reach out to Book and text him or whatever. So Book's a friend and was hugely instrumental and helpful in my time there. You know, I worked very, very closely with Cole, and it's funny. I'd actually emailed him about a month ago about something completely unrelated to wrestling, but I hadn't talked to him since he called me to tell me they were letting me go. You know why? I'm not gonna name names, but there's another former announcer there who he was friends with that he kind of let him back in a little bit via text. The next thing you know, he's getting bombarded with like, when are you gonna bring me back? And like, so I didn't want to do that, right? I didn't want to be that guy. But I had sent him a note for something, and he'd emailed me back and was, hey man, great to hear from you. I hope everything's great and blah 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 blah. So you know, Cole, I don't have anything bad to say about Michael Cole. He was great to me. Very helpful, and you know, wanted me to get better and was helpful. There were other people there. I was real close with Corey Graves when I was there. He and I came up on NXT together. Before he was even put on TV, we were in the voiceover room calling matches all day for like 7 or 8 months. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think they just shove them out there on TV. And Graves is a natural, number one. But yeah, we spent probably 7 or 8 months in the VO room, just calling stuff, and it was pretty obvious right off the bat that number one, we had some chemistry, but number two, that he was going to be really good at what he did. Was close with him, was close with Byron. Byron is one of the greatest people, one of the nicest people I've ever met. I make this joke all the time. He is either the nicest person in the world, and I even told him this. I said, you know, Saxton, I think I figured you out. He's like, what's that? I said, well, you really are either the nicest, most honest person in pro wrestling, or you're the guy that's actually stirring the pot because everybody thinks you're nice and everybody talks to you and everybody tells you everything, but secretly you're the guy moving all the puzzle pieces and all the chess pieces and, you know, pitting people against each other. And he had a good laugh about that. But no, he's a really good dude. I'm sure I'm forgetting people, but those are the names that, you know, you ask real quick. Those are the names that stand out to me. People that I'm friends with, and you know, that I can still reach out to and message and be fine with.
No, it's all great. So you now work at Gow Media. So you've been there right here 5 years. So after bouncing around, went to Rio, went to Houston, Orlando, you found some stability over here. So who was responsible for bringing you over there? And tell us, our listeners, about what you do there now.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I had some stability, I think, in Rio Grande. I mean, I was down there for 5 years, right? But you're right. I mean, you know, the nature of this kind of work is that you are going to bounce around. It's very, very rare to, you know, to stay put. You know, unless you're working at the major league level, it's rare to stay put in one place. The Gow Media thing happened. It was actually interesting the way this worked. So when I got released from WWE, I had 60 days that I could do whatever I wanted. I got paid for an extra 60 days. So it was, all right, I got to find a job. I got to come up with something. But in the meantime, I had been driving to Daytona because I was living in Orlando at the time. So I was driving to Daytona, and I had reached out to the PR guy for the minor league baseball team there and said, hey, you know, I'm in town, have some time on my hands. I've always really wanted to try my hand at baseball. You mind if I come to the games? And it was almost like the old days of driving around to the AHL rinks I had, except now it was a digital recorder that I had. But I'd go and he'd set me up in an empty space in the press box and let me call baseball for a couple of months. And, I discovered, one, I'm not that good at calling baseball, and B, I'd probably want to hang myself if I had to call 162 games a year, right? I love the game, but good Lord. You know what I mean? You're calling some extra inning, marathon in, it's 1 a.m. in May. Like, who cares? End it. You know what I mean? Put a cap on this. Let's go home. But no, I did that, and I had seen a posting for, sports update anchor, can work from anywhere. Gow Media. I had known some people over there just through my connections with Arrows. I had done some promotional stuff with Gow, and emailed my stuff to Craig Larson, who's the program director over there, and he got back to me almost immediately. He said, "Hey, Rich, how you doing?" Remembered me from the Arrows and remembered me from my time at 610, at Sports Radio 610, and he forwarded my stuff to the actual hiring manager, and like, next thing you know, I got a call from them, and it was really interesting because now at this point I was starting to freak out because my 60 days was just about up, and I'm thinking, God, what am I going to do for money, right? Like, a lot of people think, oh, you're at WWE, you're on TV, you must have made hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's like, nah, no, it doesn't work like that. Not unless you're there for a while. So anyway, it's not like I was rolling around and like I could do whatever I want for a year. Literally, when I got the offer for that job, my last paycheck for WWE, I believe it went through the day that I got offered that job. And I had been training. I actually went, there was a local transportation company. I was going to drive a luxury car until I figured out what I was going to do. It was basically like renting a taxi cab where you pay so much for the day and whatever, but it's Disney and it's all the tourist stuff. And so, in theory, there's always enough work, but I didn't really want to do that. So yeah, I had gotten licensed. I'd actually gotten my city of Orlando, like the little card you got to wear that says you're actually, licensed by the city and blah, 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 blah. Long story short is I got the offer to do that. And today's, as we're recording this, it'll be 5 years in 2 days. In 2 days from right now, it'll be 5 years since I started with them, which is kind of hard to believe. It's, so I lucked out. So, what I do is I'm the morning sports guy for a number of different radio stations. Basically, I just record stuff at home. We upload it, and then they run it. But it's a number of different markets. I have a number of different time zones that I have to cover. It's a 6 a.m. deadline in each time zone, which presents some interesting, I don't want to say difficulties, but, schedule juggling, where sometimes, depending on what's going on, if stuff's done early at night, I might be able to get my stuff done by midnight and go to bed like a normal person. Other times I'm either up until 3 or 4 in the morning. And, there are other times when I'll just go to bed and wake up at 4 and start my stuff and then do that. So I'm sure it's not healthy. I'm sure it's not good for my circadian rhythm. But to have that flexibility and to be able to work from it, I don't have to go anywhere. I can, I work from home. If I want to go somewhere, if I want to go visit my parents in Rhode Island, or I want to go visit a friend of mine or whatever, doesn't matter. I can literally be, as long as I have an internet connection and something to record with, I can be anywhere. Which is that's a positive. The negative, the money's not great, but it's, when is it in broadcasting, especially these days? Like the job I have used to be, if I cover 100 stations, how many jobs did that used to be before, everything's consolidated in radio? If you think that at least every cluster used to have a sports guy, if there are 20 clusters, so, I'm lucky. I'm thankful. It's not a bad job to have. It's fun. And it's, not a whole lot of stress either, but, yeah, it's hard to believe. You mentioned 5 years. Like, wow, how did that happen?
How did the opportunity come about for you to do some work with MLW?
Same kind of thing. So I had reached out to them. Another friend of a friend that Brian Fritz, who does some. He did a. I don't know if he's still doing his podcast. But he did a podcast, Between the Ropes, and had written for Sports Illustrated's wrestling thing, and did an interview with him and got to know some people. And I'd actually reached out, I think, to Court Bauer with MLW about just doing some podcast stuff. And next thing you know, like, it comes about, oh, we're thinking about running again. Because, they'd run MLW in the early 2000s. It folded, and he brought it back. So he was like, we're thinking of bringing this thing back. Are you interested? It was actually a guy, MSL, who was my color guy with MLW, Mr. St. Laurent, MSL. And I had done another independent show with him, and it was actually it was actually him who mentioned, hey, we got this thing coming back. Are you interested? And he didn't even realize at the time that I was still in Orlando. He's like, oh, I would have reached out to you before this if I knew you were still in Orlando. So that kind of came about, and that's another thing. That's 4 years, almost 4 years now since that started. And now, they're moving to Vice TV, which is going to be cool. I'm not 100% sure on all of my participation going forward, exactly what I'm going to be doing, but as far as I know, I will be involved at some level, whether that's being play-by-play, whatever the case is. My understanding is that I will be doing something, but that's been fun too. It was just kind of one of those things. Oh, like, you're in town? Yeah. Originally, the idea for MLW was to, I think, do most of the tapings in Orlando, and that changed. Orlando is a terrible place. It's going to sound weird. Florida's terrible for wrestling. It's an awful wrestling because they see so much of it that the crowds don't care. And when you do TV, they're on their phones and it's not a good place to tape. But long story short, that's how that came about.
Last question before we let you go.
Sure.
Who is your favorite band or group, and were they approved by Corey Graves?
Oh boy. Oh man, my favorite band. Now I'm a music guy. I mentioned I played in a band. I'm a drummer.
You did.
So and then I did college radio, whatever. So I preface this by saying that I'm a music snob. I'm very particular about the stuff that I like. Most of the stuff I like is probably, independent music or whatever. Like I do the Raven, the wrestler Raven. I do the Raven Effect. I'm on that podcast. And they always make fun of me because, oh, Rich and his pretentious music, right? So that's kind of like a ha-ha on that. I'm actually wearing the shirt of this band, the Appleseed Cast. I've been listening to them a lot. One of my favorite bands. The funny thing with Graves is they had played Tampa 5 or 6 years ago. And he had tweeted, he just happened to walk into the club they were playing one night, and they were doing a thing, and he's like, he had tweeted at them, hey, Appleseed Cast, really cool, so many drums, because there's one song where everybody's hitting floor toms or whatever, right? So I saw him the next day, I'm like, dude, I didn't know you were into Appleseed Cast. And he's like, oh, I'm really not, I just happened to walk into the the Crowbar, and they were playing, it was really cool, whatever. But they've long been one of my favorite bands, so that was kind of that meeting of the minds. I could probably go down the list. I mean, I was a big Slayer fan growing up, big thrash metal fan. Got into grindcore, stuff like Terrorizer, but then I like a lot of jangly emo, early 2000s emo. Rainer Maria is probably one of my favorite bands. The Smiths is another favorite band of mine. Even though Morrissey seems like he's a giant pain in the ass, but I love the Smiths. Yeah, I mean, I could probably rattle off a bunch of bands, but just quickly, you asked the Graves thing, the Apple. It's funny that I'm wearing the shirt. The Appleseed Cast thing just kind of that connects, I suppose.
Yeah, I used to have a phase where I listened to some of that music back in the day. The only band I really still listen to is the Ghostside. I love that band.
Is who?
The Ghostside.
I don't know them.
So they're from LA, kind of do metalcore kind of thing. And
okay.
When they were popular, their tour bus got into an accident, but when they were popular, their music used to be played at LA Kings games at Staples Center. So
interesting. I can throw one more thing in there. Coheed and Cambria. I had seen them. Yeah. I saw them on right when the first record came out. It would have been March of 2002. They were playing with a bunch of other bands in Hartford, Connecticut, and I actually went to go see the opening band. This band called the Rocking Horse Winter, which is a Florida band. And I'd gone to see them, and I had a mini disc recorder, and I recorded the set. and I was gonna leave because I had to work in the morning. Hartford's like an hour from where I live, so I had to work. And there was a kid shooting video, and he's like, "Where are you going?" It's like, "I'm going home." He's like, "No. You got to see Coheed." And I didn't know anything about them. He's like, and I was like, "Well, okay, what do they sound like?" He's like, "Well, picture Iron Maiden with a 4-year-old girl singing." And I was like, "What?" So I was like, "Okay, I got to check this out." So I actually have that set recorded.
It's pretty funny.
And there's 150 people, small show. And I actually bought the CD that night from Claudio, and I could still see him. He's wearing a Bane T-shirt, the hardcore band Bane, and he's eating a cheeseburger. And I bought the CD from him, and I was like, "Hey man, the set was awesome." He's like, "No, thanks." And I saw them, that summer I saw them a bunch of times, and then they became, eventually they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, he's in video games and Guitar World magazine and all that stuff. But it was pretty cool seeing them early on. But the correlation there is that NXT used to use a Coheed song as its intro, and I was so excited that the first NXT show that I did, I'm psyched. I'm like, okay, they're gonna, and then my first show they changed they changed to whatever theme song they changed to. I was so pissed. I was like, God damn, man, I wanted the open to be the Coheed song, but yeah, that's another funny, I guess, cross reference, I suppose.
Yeah, everything was great. Rich Bocchini, I got you. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. What we do here is we always give our guests the last word. So if there's anything else you would like to share or promote, go ahead. Floor is all yours. You can talk about anything you want. You can talk about anybody you want. So
I won't. I will resist the urge to sling mud. I know Alex got into some of that. You guys know the deal, and anybody who listens to this can probably.
Rich, you make major bank at these autograph signings.
Oh yeah, huge money at autograph signings. I'm highly in demand. Highly in demand at autograph signings. What do I want to promote? There's a couple things here. So on my Twitter, if you're interested, you want to follow me on Twitter, at Rich Bocchini, RichBoccini. I'm involved in a group out of Pittsburgh now called Enjoy Wrestling. And there's a show called Canned Heat. It's a series, 5 episodes per season. I think as we're recording this, we're on show 3 of season 2. But that's on YouTube. It's free. Enjoy Wrestling. At Enjoy Wrestling, so check that out. Warrior Wrestling is a group out of Chicago that I do some stuff with. It's basically the Paul Bosch type all-star wrestling show of this generation, where you have a lot of lucha guys coming in, some AEW people, some Impact people. It's a really cool promotion out of Chicago. And then I mentioned Defy Wrestling, I think, out of Seattle is another group I work with, and they're going to be coming back in August. They're on Pluto TV. If you check out the Pro Wrestling channel at 732, you can see Defy on there. And then I mentioned MLW. Check them out online at Major League Wrestling, MLW.com. Be on Vice TV this coming fall. So, yeah, there's a couple of things that I have going on. But again, the Twitter, Rich Bocchini, RichBoccini. Follow me on there. And I'd like to be, I'm active with people that send me notes and like to talk to people and all that stuff. So hope to hear from some of you out there in listener world.
Rich, it's been an absolute pleasure. We thank you so much for coming on with us and resisting the urge to maybe drag some people through the dirt sheets, so to say.
Yeah, I've done that before, and time to move onward and upward. You know what I mean? I'll just say this: karma's a bitch. So
there you go. All right, so that's gonna do it here for this episode. Right, for our special guest Rich, for my co-host Joe, I'm Nick, and this has been You Know All Right.